Hello, this is Kade, and the Hammerhead Q&A has of course come out, and it gave me a chance to read through it and also do a bit more research into especially the Hammerhead Polaris and some of the other systems to, work a little bit better on my comparison. And through that I've made a couple of errors in judgment previously on these two ships, and also the Q&A has brought up some other items that I found interesting to discuss. So I will go quickly through the Q&A questions. As far as when they are not really too interesting, I will go in a bit more detail on the ones that I do find interesting. Before I do that, I want to make one correction. I previously cited the Polaris only had 10 torpedoes. That's absolutely incorrect. I think I was confused with size 10 torpedoes, but it actually has a total of 28 size 10 torpedoes. So that is a significantly larger payload package, which means that you'll be able to stay around in the fight longer. Question, of course, how quickly will it reload those tubes, because it still only has 4 tubes. But of course it also means that the total cost of the whole package is going to be substantially higher even then. That said, of course, the cost of those weapons is still an unknown factor, but assumptions still are for most people that they will be quite expensive. So that's one thing to notice right away, and some other points we'll address as we read through the Q&A of the Hammerhead. The first question asks, are the computers powerful enough to AI control all of the turrets? And they're like, well, it's still, in development, we don't really know, but we estimate that you could control 4 out of 6 by AI. Now, another question they ask, how effective would it be to run the ship with a friend or two and fill the rest up with NPC crews? And you'd be like, well, you have to weigh and outweigh the possibilities and costs and everything, but it's very much possible. The reason I'm combining these two is because, well, I think for gameplay mechanics, the differences between an AI controlled turret and a AI NPC controlled turret, I don't assume will be very much massive. The only difference being in one case you have the ship's computer run them, which likely means that the ship's computer will have less processing power to do other things, mind you. And the other times you have an NPC running it, but in the end they will probably operate the same. And what I'm really curious about is how they're going to deal with effective focus firing. So can I have somebody in the ship, maybe somebody in a turret that still has a human crew member in there, or if they're all NPCs, can I go from the bridge and prioritize target? Because the capability to focus fire is one of the most important things in any combat scenario, because you want to either take a ship out of the fight or outright destroy it, and not just blow its shields off every time, watch it go out of range, recharge its shields and come back at you, because, well, you get none the wiser when they do that. And of course, if you got 6 people in the turrets all on voice comms, and you got your guy in the chair, flying the ship, and maybe he will prioritize targets, and maybe the person in the top turret will be calling out primary target, Gladiator flown by Dave, secondary target, FC7 Hornet flown by Jacob, tertiary target will be the Gladius flown by Jane, and go on with a list like that. That way all of the human pilots will instantly know which ships to look for, and if they see any okay, I see both Jane and I see Jacob was higher on the list, so I'll start shooting at Jacob. And that way, more turrets are focused on one target, and the chances that you will either disable the target that is out of the fight or outright destroy it are a lot larger. And that's what you really want to do in any fight. You want to remove a gun from the fight, so to speak. So every ship you take out of the fight is one ship less to shoot at you or your friends. Fair or not, doesn't matter, you want to take them out of the fight. With a NPC controlled crew or an AI controlled turrets, is that going to be possible to do that in an effective, quick manner? I hope personally that it's not going to be the case, so that they will be a little bit more random and maybe you can prioritize targets, but it's a bit more clumsy. Which would mean that there is an actual very clear advantage into having player turret operators, because they can coordinate a lot better. The next question, which I'm also going to bring up with another question, is, are the large power plants sufficient to run those 24 size 4 laser cannons? Or is the Hammerhead designed to use ballistic cannons? Answer is yes, they are capable of handling all those energy weapons, They are very efficient military-grade power plants for this purpose. However, running ballistic weapons does provide another avenue of pursuit in terms of maintaining fire output, which is called the classic thing, the energy... in essence, energy weapons work on like a capacitor-based system. So they have a certain amount of power pre-stored. When you fire, you go through that power list and it's gradually recharged, but generally the recharge rate is slower than the rate of firing. So an energy weapon, when it's depleted, will need a time to recharge, regain its energy before it can start to fire again. Or what you generally see right now, when they are depleted, the fire rate drops to the rate of the power being recharged. Of course, a ballistics weapon can in essence keep on firing until it either overheats or it runs out of ammunition, in which case it will have to reload the ammunition. Well, it could be very safely assumed that perhaps a ballistic weapon, when properly cooled, could maintain fire on target for a longer period of time. So that's always going to be trade-offs, and of course the trade-off is going to be in the cost of the ballistics ammunition, which is something you'll have to consider. So the other point that we're going to break into it, I have to scroll down a little bit, is does the Hammerhead come with military spec components or civilian ones, since it's a military ship being sold to civilians? It comes with military grade C items stock, although once these are worn out, people may find it more efficient to replace with other types for durability, given the expense and rarity of replacing these. Now this for me is a very interesting one, because if we go and look at the shipyard, and we're looking at item classifications, there are a total of 5 item classifications. They are as follows: military, the best overall at that item's functionality at the expense of emissions and cost. So very expensive, really high emissions. They don't really care that we are here to be seen, because, well, if we want to be hiding, we'll be hiding, and we're not. Civilian, very common, wide range of behaviors to suit all costs. Like you can go very cheap but not very efficient, or you can go perhaps really efficient, very powerful but also really expensive. A top of the line civilian grade component could very well match military grade component, but at a much higher cost even. It will be, pretty much anything will fall into that spectrum. But generally, military items will be likely have less durability, but be really good at whatever they need to be doing, because they're purposely built, purposely designed to do this specific task. Durability for military use is not a very critical item, especially because UAE has been mostly at war or in conflict one way or the other. So the assumption is if you build a military unit, it's going to get likely blown up within a certain span of time. So making something that lasts beyond that span of time for a lot longer is like a waste of resources, because chances are it's get blown up before it ever reaches that age. So why bother? And if it does reach that age, well, we'll just replace the components. Because, hallelujah, well, we're lucky this one lasted longer. We'll replace the components, and maybe we're lucky and it will be worthwhile again. That's the military way of thinking. For civilians, because, the cost of everything matters, so they will be looking more at durability. And we're looking at even more when we look at industrial components, which are reliably high output and low wear, but high emissions. So with industrial, you can likely assume that components will be a bit more bulky, less refined, but they will just chuck on, though. If you look at industrial equipment, even nowadays, it's designed to last and endure, because whenever something in an industrial environment breaks, it costs money. Because, well, if something is breaking in an industrial environment, it means it's not earning the money it should be earning, which means it's costing the company money. Take a trucking company, for example. If your truck is not riding around with cargo or getting paid to drive anywhere, it's in essence costing you money, because it's not making you money. And you paid for the truck. And most businesses, they don't say like, this truck cost us 200,000, so we write off 200,000. Now they'd be like, okay, this truck cost us 200,000, we'll operate it for 10 years, we expect the residual value at the end of those 10 years to be 50,000. So we will write off 15,000 a year. That's how a business looks at its expenses. So if that truck would be broken down for a month in a year, it would cost them over 1,500 or about 1,200, I think, rough estimate, in cost, purely in cost, without even calculating how much money the truck could have made if it were operational. So that's with industrial and components. It's very important that they are reliable. As an exchange, they tend to be, relatively large. So reliable high output does not mean it's going to be high output for the size of the component. It's likely going to be lower output relatively in size. So a military grade component, the same size to an industrial component, the military component will output more, but at a higher cost and lower durability. Emissions wise, it'll probably be a toss-up. Two other component levels which are not really too relevant, but I'll mention right now. Stealth, well, very simple, very expensive, but it's going to be everything about reducing signatures and consumption, but it's going to lose a lot of functionality. And competition, well, yeah, those things are literally get as much out of whatever size you got at the cost of everything else. It doesn't matter what it consumes, doesn't matter what it emits, doesn't matter how long it lasts. It needs to last for a race. I mean, of course, for example, with racing, Formula 1, for example, they are really trying to force teams to lower the cost with all the engine-less changes, which is not really working, but they're the side. Because if you would not do that, teams would literally run one engine for qualifying. Doesn't matter if it gets blown up at the end of qualifying, we'll just put in a new engine for the race, and if at the end of the race that engine is just totally worn out and gone, it doesn't matter, we'll put in a new one for the next race if they got the money. Because, why bother? We want to get the most out of it. It doesn't need to last a long time. That's competition grade components. So, back to our Hammerhead. We have military grade component stock, but I mentioned they are grade C items. So what that tells to me is that they're going to be the lowest quality level within the military grade component items. I would not be surprised if the actual Navy gets A grade components, ships sold to militias and things like that may get B grade components, and when they're being sold to us civilians, we get C grade components. Because of course, as a government, you still want to keep an edge over the civilians at all times, even if you like your civilians very much. So it's going to be an interesting thing to see, especially once you get to that point where you need to start replacing components. Because somebody that's been operating the ship really in a combat shape, they likely will have to replace components even when they get damaged. But they will be needing the output of those military grade components. So they likely will be investing again in military grade components because, it's designed to output that and it needs that. And maybe some civilian grade components could offer that same output, perhaps even be more durable, but the cost would be much higher even than those military grade components, even though those are really of high cost. Well, that's of course the nice thing with civilian grade components. The cost can be rock bottom barrel and sky freaking high, way above anything that the military would ever spend on something. Of course, we're a bit theory crafting again there, but that's how I could see this happening. So if you're just using this ship for security purposes, you might very well look at your power plants and be like, well, I'll replace them with maybe a pair of civilians or maybe a pair of industrial ones, and change some of the weapons to ballistic weapons. Because whenever I do get into combat, we'll take the cost hit of the ammunition, because that'll be whatever. But over the longer endurance and operational period of that ship, the costs are going to be lower because I'm not investing as much into the components I'm putting on there. Hell, you may even consider stripping out the military components right when you buy it, stockpile them and sell them when there is a demand for them to somebody that actually needs those military grade components, because they mention they're going to be harder to find. While you using the ship as a security ship for your mining operation, for your endurance is a lot more important than having the best of the best that can be fitted in there. Because, well, the primary role of the ship is just going to be scaring off anybody that's going to attack you. And if somebody is going to attack you, ballistic weapons will work fine and will just pay for the ammunition. It's going to be an additional expense, but likely worth it. So that's one of the most interesting bits I found within this Q&A. Another very interesting bit was with the fuel tanks. It does seem to have, the Hammerhead seems to have a very short range because of its M-size quantum fuel tank in relation to the L size of the Polaris. And I mentioned this, it's designed to operate around the fleet. Pardon me. So it's designed to operate around the fleet. So it will go away from the fleet to a few spots and go back to the fleet, refuel. The Polaris clearly is made to operate more independently for a longer duration. Because when we're looking at hardpoint sizes, what they tell you is an M size is only a third of the size of an L size. So that means that, in essence, a Hammerhead only has a third of the quantum jump range of a Polaris. And I guess in a way this makes sense, but it also proves me wrong in an earlier thought I had about the patrol nature of this ship. Because it's not meant to patrol like a system, it's just meant to patrol around a fleet. It will go away from the fleet to scout around a bit, be around there and go back to the fleet. While the Polaris, of course, being designed as a militia ship, is likely going to have, multiple day patrols perhaps around the system. So it will be quantum jumping around the system for a while before heading back to base. Which is not something I guess then the Hammerhead will be doing. Of course, it could be relative. Maybe the Hammerhead could jump around for 2 days and the Polaris could jump around for a week, but the point still stands. So it does give the Polaris another edge, in addition to the larger torpedo loadout we mentioned before. Power plant wise, I guess the Polaris could have spare a bit more power because of the weapons loadout, but we'll have to see that. We don't really know how the weapon sizes are going to impact power requirements. Maneuverability wise, they also ask about it. It's going to be, they're not dock ships, but the Hammerhead likely is going to be a bit more maneuverable, and it's going to be designed to be really smooth in maneuvering to help those turrets stay on target. Always handy to have. On another note, also with the sizes and the range, I guess that also means that capital class radar of the Polaris is actually going to make a larger difference than I would have assumed previously. Because if it's really going to be out there and patrolling on its own, lore-wise, then yeah, I guess that capital class radar will indeed be quite a bit better than the sizes that the Hammerhead has featured. I still think, personally, that I would not like the Polaris as a patrolling ship because of, the nature of it. But, if it is what the lore says they use, it's what they use. And I guess it is a nice thing if you have a very heavy payload on your patrolling ship, so that if somebody shows up with a larger ship, you can immediately greet them with a very nice salvo of size 10 torpedoes. Another thing is that they asked is what would be the ideal counter to the Hammerhead, and what does the Hammerhead counter? Well, I think we all figured out what the Hammerhead counters. Smaller ships that are coming in within the range of its guns. They're just going to get chewed up for breakfast, lunch and dinner. So don't do that, you're going to lose. But they mentioned very specifically that the Retaliator, as a dedicated anti-capital ship, would be very capable of fighting the Hammerhead effectively by tackling it from the outside. So the effective range of its guns. Put me a bit of a thought, because a lot of people are the Polaris probably would strike with the torpedoes at the Hammerhead really effectively. And if we're looking at missile sizes, what they're saying is a size 3 missile would be 3 meters and then 30 centimeters in diameter. The Retaliator fires size 9 torpedoes, 9 meters long, which I don't think they are, but we'll see, and it would be then 90 centimeters in diameter, and the Polaris with size 10s would be 10 meters long and 10 centimeters in diameter. That's not a huge difference actually in there. Of course, it's then the additional diameter makes it quite a more bigger of a payload, but the main thing is the size of the target of the torpedo. It means that I think both a size 9 and a size 10 potentially could be shot down by turrets, but also it will be more difficult than I previously thought. So I guess, yes, the Polaris putting out a bunch of torpedoes towards the Hammerhead could put the Hammerhead in quite some trouble. Of course, depending on the side of the engagement, if it's a one-on-one and you're going to stay out of the gun range and you're firing those torpedoes, the likely response of a Hammerhead is just to make a short quantum jump. And you'd be like, bye-bye torpedoes, because they will have a travel time to get over there. Of course, depends on how quickly you can spool up the quantum jump and other factors, but in one-on-one engagement, I think you have to be closer to launch those torpedoes and get in close range with all of those weapon systems, so it's still going to be tricky. But of course, in the end, like, the Polaris is designed to take out larger ships. The Hammerhead is designed to take out smaller ships. So the edge would be in the hands of the Polaris. I'll grant you that much. Still, either way, it's not a fight I would pick. Because, well, why would you, as a Hammerhead, you would never go and attack a Polaris. It's not your target. As a Polaris attacking a sole Hammerhead, it'd be like, you know, at range, as I said, if they can just quantum jump out of it, then it would be kind of pointless, because you have to get in closer and risking all the firepower of the Hammerhead. And even then, if a Hammerhead spots the Polaris coming in, and even the Polaris may have a much larger sensor range, the Hammerhead will still spot the Polaris before it gets into weapon range. So the Hammerhead will just be like, yeah, no thank you, and be like, I'm out of here. So you would always need more ships, because you need something to prevent a Hammerhead from jumping out, for example. It needs to be previously engaged, and a lot of other things. But I think in a one-on-one fight, if they really would both stand their ground and fight, Polaris, victor. What other questions did we not have yet? We had the NPC reworked in military spec. Oh, they made mention of like smaller missiles and torpedoes. Assumption right now probably is, I would say, torpedoes would be less likely. Smaller missiles may very well be possible. It depends on how they will integrate them. Because if the weapon, the ordnance hardpoints will be dedicated ones, like on the Miss or the Constellation, then you cannot change them. However, if they're going to be using standard ordnance hardpoints, in theory there should be nothing that prevents you from changing them. So if we look at the theory, they currently have the 683 racks. So that should translate to, what was it again? Yeah. So 683 means we have a rack size of 6 with 8 missiles of size 3 each. So a size 6 missile launcher which can hold 8 missiles of size 3. We could translate that downwards. I think, you know, perhaps you could fit torpedoes in there. Question of course is, why would you want torpedoes on a Hammerhead? Because the Hammerhead's targets are designed to be smaller ships. So having those missiles seems a lot more useful than having torpedoes. That said, if you're operating your Hammerhead on a more solistic operation, like it's more on its own with minimal escorts, you know, and you have to deal with something larger, if you can't put torpedoes on the Hammerhead, it may not get the large amount of torpedoes or even the size that a Polaris can field. It could still be a very good means at dealing with larger targets. So a Hammerhead outfitted even with smaller torpedoes in that fight with the Polaris would make that fight suddenly a lot more interesting. Because, well, yeah, the torpedoes are smaller, but it's still going to have firing a lot of you at them at you. And if they're going to be standard launchers and not these tubes that the Polaris has, it means it can fire more in a shorter span of time. So it's going to be really, really interesting, I think, between those two if we're going to put torpedoes on a Hammerhead. So that might change that engagement, but we'll still have to see if that's possible. And I think, in essence, you know, keeping the missiles makes more sense for the dedicated role of this ship. Also mentioned made like things, quality of life features missing, kitchens, meeting area, mess hall, etc., etc. Long answer short, it has all the basics, and that's going to be it. So yeah, you're going to be looking at that pool table on the Polaris and be like, oh, I wish we had that. Things could get boring. But when you're in a fight, you'd be like, did I really need the pool table, or am I glad that I got an additional gun instead of the pool table? You know, trade-offs. But I think considering that with the range is likely that the Polaris could be out on patrol longer, having a bit of R&R capability on board makes a lot of sense. Well, it would not surprise me when the crews of the Hammerheads would actually, maybe they would dock up with a larger capital ship, and the crews from the Hammerhead would enjoy some R&R on board the facilities of the larger capital ship. Maybe they would even rotate crews in and out. So they would go on a patrol, a crew is on there, they come back, the crew gets off, and new crew gets on there, ship gets refueled and goes out on patrol again. So it would be rotating crews which are based on a larger capital ship. Could very well be a possibility. We'll just have to see, of course, how that's going to work out. I do think that most crews will be quite dedicated to their ships, but I think one way or another they will make use of the facilities of larger ships. Much like in World War II, how submarines and destroyers made use of those facilities. One of the well-known examples is like when they would rescue pilots, either be the scout pilots from battleships or, pilots from carriers, and they would return them to their home ship. And often in return they would get things like ice cream, because a submarine or a destroyer in those times period did not have the facilities on board to make or keep ice cream. So that was a real treat for the crews of those ships. So that's a way to boost morale a bit. And morale in combat is of course a very important thing. They made the notion like the firing arcs of the turrets. You see nearly all turrets firing forwards. Is it going to be very effective? It's going to be expected. Well, long story short, again, the Hammerhead's designed to provide a danger field of fire in all directions. So firing all 5 turrets, which is still the maximum amount at one target. There are not going to be many situations in which you can manage that. If you can, of course, it's going to be really nice. Well, I would say 3 to 4 turrets is more to be expected, but hey, take what you can get. And anyway, you don't want to approach this thing with a small ship from any angle. They ask like, the turrets look quite fragile, it's going to be a major weakness. Well, in order for such a thing to be a major weakness, you need to be able to specifically target them. In order to be able to specifically target something like that, you have to be fairly close, likely in a smaller ship, and you don't want to get close in a smaller ship. So, are they a weakness? Yes. Is it going to be a problem? Likely not. Question about inconsistency in stats. Well, yeah, they're very fluid, and not everything was yet done, so there were some mistakes in there. About the giant hole in the middle, like, why is it there? Design asked for these and these purposes. Filling up the space would have been useless. Likely the design is there for a very good reason. As I said, to me, one of the things is still like if you get blown up on side, like you could have enough structural rigidity to keep flying the ship. If you would have a narrow neck without a hole that gets blown up, then your ship is done for. Just my personal opinion. Either way, can you put something in there at all? No. It's not designed to take anything. It's just empty space. And that pretty much covers all of it regarding the Hammerhead Q&A and some of the changes regarding the Polaris. I still think for the large majority of people, the Hammerhead's going to be the best ship, especially if you're not a combat dedicated organization. Hammerheads are going to serve you a lot better because, well, they are designed to protect things. So having a Hammerhead to protect your assets makes a lot of sense, and it just increases the cost of attacking whatever you're doing. If you're in a combat dedicated organization, I still think that the cost of all those torpedoes could come out quite high. But, the size difference is not that large, so maybe the cost is not going to be extreme, but I still think it's going to be really quite high. And without really further data, that's what I'm going to stay with. So that's something you'll have to consider very carefully if you want that really high cost strike package. Or if a more defensive oriented ship like the Hammerhead could suit your needs quite fine, because you're not going to be tackling capital ships. It's a trade-off. That said, I can, with the larger amount of torpedoes that I now see on there and some of the other facts, yes, I can see the Polaris having a couple more edges over the Hammerhead. But I would still say, if you're military focused, look at the costs. Right now, maybe keep a means of changing between these two ships perhaps, or have both. Something along those lines. And just, wait until we know what kind of cost we can expect for all of these torpedoes. Because once you know the cost of those torpedoes, cost for other items, you can start to do some comparisons and math, and you can start working out if that strike package is going to be worth the initial investment. I mean, in the end, you can always buy a Polaris back if you melted it for a Hammerhead, for example. So, options are there. We have to keep our minds open. As I said, if you're not combat focused, Hammerhead's going to be the best option for you. If you are, Polaris has gotten a few more bonuses in my opinion, but I still like the Hammerhead a lot more. Especially if you have access already to something like an Idris, then a Hammerhead is a much better companion ship to an Idris than a Polaris would be, in my personal opinion. Anyhow, I hope this has been informative, and I know it's been another very long video about this, but there's been quite a bit of information and things to discuss, I believe. So I do hope you found it informative. As always, keep the discussion going in the comment sections. I very much enjoy seeing it and also participating in it. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.